gift. Two rival Los Zetas cartel members. With a stick in his hands, El Chapo beat these men so badly he fractured many of their bones. As one witness later put it, the men were so broken they looked like rag dolls. The men were then slung over ATVs and taken to a raging bonfire, where El Chapo pulled out his gun, made some derogatory comments about the guys' moms before shooting them, and then ordered their bodies to be burned. He said to one of his workers, "I don't want any bones to remain." That was El Chapo to a T. Heartless, relentless, and ruthless protector of his monopoly. Roughly 30 years prior, in the 1980s, the mother of one of Pablo Escobar's friends was riding a bus in Colombia. The driver didn't see that the woman hadn't quite fully stepped off the bus when he drove off, leading to her falling and dying. The King of Coke was upset by what had happened and ordered one of his hitmen, Jairo Velasquez, aka Popeye, to kill the bus
and Doug.
Okay, here's what you want to do. Save hundreds of Liberty
driver. Speaking about the incident later, Popeye said, "I found the driver and killed him. I didn't feel anything." We're guessing the man who ordered the hit didn't feel any remorse either. So there you go, just two examples of how these famous drug kingpins were quite similar. They both ran zero-tolerance campaigns when it came to anyone that bothered them. And they were cruel and unusual people. And while they shared a lot of similarities, you will also see that they were quite different. Let's start with Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera. That's a bit of a mouthful, so we'll stick with his nickname El Chapo. That translates as Shorty. El Chapo was born on April 4, 1957 in a rival part of Mexico in the state of Sinaloa. He was poor, dirt poor, and there were many mouths to feed in his large family. His father made his income as a cattle rancher, but it wasn't the most lucrative business to be in. So El Chapo used to sell oranges to get some extra cash. He dropped out of school at a young age and began working with his father full-time. At 15, he started another side business, this time with marijuana instead of oranges, as a means to help out with family finances. And by age 20, he was already working with Mexican cartels. It's what you might call a rags to riches story. Working in the fields, earning $2 a day wasn't for El Chapo. The illegal substances industry was way more lucrative. Escobar has some surprising similarities in his early life. Born Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria on December 1, 1949, he grew up in a small town called Rio Negro, which is about 45 minutes from Medellin in Colombia. His mother, Emilda, was a school teacher and his father, Abel, was a cattle farmer just like El Chapo's. Though Escobar's early life wasn't quite as humble as El Chapo's, he was also part of a big family and was one of 7 kids, though his family didn't struggle as much financially. But young Pablo was always around narcotics, specifically marijuana and cocaine, and it didn't take him long to realize the financial opportunity they represented, especially when it was sold to Americans who were quickly embracing cocaine with a passion. Back to El Chapo and his rise to power. First, he worked for a cartel when a number of Mexican drug cartels were part of an alliance formed by one Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, aka El Padrino. The Godfather really got things organized and moved enough coke into the US to keep Wall Street bankers partying for the next millennia. Guzman became a major player in the Sinaloa cartel under one Hector El Güero Palma. Palma liked El Chapo. He was trustworthy and he also wasn't scared to use violence. Cross him or mess up his shipment and bang bang, that was it. When the Godfather was eventually arrested, a power vacuum was created in the Mexican drug trade. Various cartels, including the Sinaloa cartel, wanted the best routes to get their Colombian coke into the booming US market. Even the DEA knows that when you take out a boss, all that happens is lots and lots of violence and basically no interruption of the flow of drugs. So with the Godfather put away, what naturally happened is bodies started piling up. The violence was incredibly brutal. People were getting sawn in half with chainsaws, heads literally rolled in the streets. In 1995, when El Chapo's associate was arrested, he was finally able to take control of the Sinaloa cartel.
God damn, this man crazy. You saying that like it ain't nothing, or you just chopping people up.
Cartel. He was just 38 years old. It was a meteoric rise from the cattle farmer to drug lord. Soon his cartel would become the most powerful in all of Mexico. He had cops in his front pocket, local politicians in the back, and he even managed to bribe his way out of prison. Escobar, on the other hand, was involved in all sorts of petty crimes as a child, but it was in his early 20s that he got into more serious violent crime and kidnapping while working with a local mobster. He had a reputation for being a very violent and unpredictable young man. He made a bigger name for himself when he kidnapped a local businessman who had recently laid off many poor workers. His family paid the ransom, but Pablo and his gang killed the man anyway. Pablo soon had his eyes set on bigger profits, and in Colombia that meant one thing: cocaine. He knew you could buy stacks of coca leaves for pennies, turn them into paste, and sell the product to US dealers who were seeing a huge demand for the drug. It was the 1970s, the time of the hippies had ended, and Americans were turning towards disco music. LSD and Mary Jane said their goodbyes, and Mr. Cocaine made his entrance to the party. There were no drug cartels back then, and Escobar realized in his early 20s that he could make a fortune and make it fast. Cocaine was like the Louis Vuitton of drugs. You could take a cheap product and sell it for outrageous prices. At 26, Escobar had already banked $3 million, which today would be about $15 million. And unlike El Chapo, he did it without having to chop off any heads. He could have bought a big house with a swimming pool and retired, but of course, for these guys it's never enough. In the late 90s, El Chapo was also moving methamphetamine into the US. He could produce the stuff without much hassle from the authorities, and it proved to be very popular with Americans who like to do a lot of house cleaning or play video games for 3 days straight without sleeping. It was also very cheap compared
What the fuck did he just say? What's that got to do with video games? Do not got nothing to do with no meth.
to coke. Another benefit for the cartel was the fact that he didn't have to buy it from the Colombians. He could have his people make it in meth labs and move it straight into the US. He soon became the boss of bosses and had control of the cartels in many states in Mexico. He became the new godfather and wielded great power. He was arrested and imprisoned but broke out of prison in 2001. That breakout apparently cost him $2.5 million, or virtually nothing to Mexico's new boss of bosses. But soon the peace pact that the cartels had made was broken, and before you could say chainsaw, thousands upon thousands of people were caught up in the violence that followed and killed. This included civilians, women, and children, as well as those directly involved with the cartels. El Chapo somehow stayed on top, and it's thought he was protected at least in part by the DEA since he gave up a lot of other cartel members. He was wanted in the US, but because he helped the DEA, that indictment was dropped for a time. The violence didn't stop, and what happened was one of the bloodiest and most vile turf wars the world has ever seen, with people killed in the most horrific ways. Men were tortured, cut to pieces, beheaded, and in one especially gruesome case, a man's face was stitched onto a soccer ball and sent back to his cartel. As for Escobar, his people were also extreme, and it's thought his gang killed as many as 4,000 people during their cocaine dealing days. They took out leading politicians, lawyers, and even blew up an airplane carrying a presidential candidate, killing 107 people. Escobar's power was greater than anything El Chapo would ever have. He really was the king of coke. Whereas El Chapo was more like a very big flash in the pan, Escobar created the business of trafficking cocaine, while the Mexican gangs were merely buying their cocaine or
That's crazy.
being paid to move it for them. Escobar was also seen as a kind of Robin Hood figure, since he gave a significant amount of cash to poor communities and built up infrastructure like schools and hospitals. While the murder rate in Medellin was out of control, Escobar was out of El Chapo and the Mexican cartel's league when it came to killing. Sure, he blew up buildings and made Medellin the murder capital of the world. He killed lawyers and took out around 600 cops, but his level of violence was not close to what would later happen in Mexico. He had so much control he simply didn't have the need to fight off a large number of competing cartels. He was also a master at public relations, and he ran things more like a business than an unruly, bloodthirsty mob. It was simple with him. You take the money, or you take the bullet. The deal he gave to officials was an offer they couldn't refuse, plato o plomo, silver or lead, and it was a very real offer. And the Colombian authorities had every right to be fearful of this powerful man. He could bribe or take out anyone, no matter how high they were in their particular office. At one point, Escobar was getting around 15 tons of cocaine into the US every single day. This worked out to something like $26 billion a year for the cartel. Forbes even put Escobar down as one of the richest.
Right, come on, bro. Look at it. Take the closed caches off. 30 billion? And back then, that shit was some bread. That shit was some bread back then.
Men in the world with a net worth of $30 billion. He truly was the king. El Chapo may have been successful, but he was never the king. Or if he was, his kingdom paled in comparison to Escobar's. Escobar was
Y'all heard that, right? Chapo ain't even close.
killed in 1993 at 44 years old. At the time of his death, he had more money stashed away than you can imagine. He owned properties all over the world. 25,000 Colombians mourned for their real-life Robin Hood at his funeral. But did the drugs stop moving after Escobar's death? Of course not. They just started getting trafficked by different people, namely the Cali cartel. This cartel also had power in politics and could easily buy off certain law enforcement agencies. One thing that did change is the crime rate and murder rate in Medellin did go down by a lot, but mostly because cocaine now comes out of other South American countries. The stuff is cheap and easy to grow, although the farmers don't make much from it. And that's one reason why the traffickers don't mind getting their shipments stopped. It doesn't cost much to buy from the producers, so if you lose a shipment, it's no big deal. It's as simple as that. The risks are great, since you might get killed or tortured or imprisoned, but the profits are too good not to do business. El Chapo wasn't killed like Escobar, but was arrested for the last time in 2014 when he was 56 years old. How much cash he had is up for debate. The US has been looking for his money for years and has come up with next to nothing. Meanwhile, reports suggest it cost the US taxpayer billions of dollars to capture this cartel leader, who was simply replaced in a heartbeat. The Sinaloa cartel is still as big as it ever was, with its biggest competitor arguably being the Jalisco New Generation. The DEA is now spending more billions trying to capture the leaders of those gangs, who will only be replaced by a never-ending queue of men ready to take their place. Cocaine use in the US and in many parts of Europe, especially the UK, is on the rise as we speak. So it's likely these men will just continue to get more and more powerful. Since El Chapo's arrest and the power vacuum opened in its wake, Mexico's murder rate had steadily increased and hit an all-time high in 2019. A report released by the Secretariat of Public Security stated that there were over 34,582 murders in Mexico that year, and in March 2020, the highest number ever of homicides was reported, 2,585. Why compare these two world-famous drug lords? Well, one reason is so that you can see that the war on drugs will never end and can't be won. And another reason is to show you that El Chapo was just one guy in the game. He was replaced, and some other guy will probably get some media attention soon. He'll become the #1 outlaw and scapegoat for something that's much bigger than him. As for Escobar, well, sure, he's been replaced, but let's remember one thing. He started the game. He was no flash in the pan. He was the very fire that ignited decades of cocaine use and abuse in the USA and across the world. Now go watch this.
Come on, bro. It's no comparison. There's no comparison. Pablo better. There's no comparison, bro. Pablo's better.
Been dominated by two groups in the last 50 years. The dreaded Medellin and the Sinaloa cartels of Mexico. More famous than the cartels, however, were their notorious leaders. The Medellin's Pablo Escobar and Sinaloa's Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Their reigns have ended, no doubt, Escobar in a bloody shootout in December 1993, and El Chapo's arrest in 2016, where he was extradited to the US and sentenced to jail for a very long time. But in their time, both were an unstoppable force in South America. Between the two, who was the richer and more powerful? Let's find out. The rise to crime. Escobar. The one thing that both drug lords had in common was their rags-to-riches story. Both came from humble beginnings, and both grew up in drug-infested communities that influenced them to choose a life of crime. Both were sons of farmers, but while Escobar's father was a regular farmer, Guzman's father was already farming marijuana on his own plantation in the village of La Tuna, Sinaloa, Mexico. Escobar's poverty and life in Medellin was harsh. He was a street thug in his early teens, robbing cars, until he graduated to working as a kidnapper and bodyguard for drug smugglers like Alvaro Prieto, who operated in the Medellin and wanted to earn $1 million by the age of 22. For Escobar, it was a stepping stone to a life of untold riches, fame, violence, and crime. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Guzman, on the other hand, fed up with his father squandering away the family earnings, opened his own marijuana farm when he was a teenager, along with 4 cousins. Not satisfied with the money he was making, he ultimately went to work for his uncle, who introduced him to the higher-ups in the cartels of Mexico. Guzman began working for drug lord Hector El Güero Palma, who ran a syndicate that transported. Guzman began working for drug lord.
Bro, you don't even know. He don't even look Spanish, bro. He look white.
Lord Hector El Güero Palma, who ran a syndicate that transported drugs from Mexico to the USA. Guzman's job was to make sure the consignments were transported safely across the border. It was during this time that Guzman's notoriety gained popularity as a man who did not tolerate failure and eliminated enemies and double-crossers without a second thought. Who was most powerful? Pablo Escobar and Joaquin Guzman may have ruled over the drug trade in South America at different timelines, but their climb to the top was similar and marked a world of competition, vendettas, shocking violence, unspeakable and horrific crimes, and tons of wealth. It was Escobar's death and the downfall of Medellin in the early 90s that made Guzman the most powerful drug lord of South America. But when you compare the two in terms of power, it is Escobar who held an edge over El Chapo. Escobar enjoyed a lot of political patronage and government support for almost the entirety of his drug trafficking career. Pablo Escobar enjoyed government support. Pablo Escobar was so powerful, he even got himself elected to the Chamber of Representatives of Colombia. He engaged heavily in politics and bribed judges, policemen, and politicians. He cared little for social status, and as much as he patronized them with money, anyone opposing him would be dealt with swiftly. He led by the principle of bullet or bribe, and it was folly for anyone to refuse the latter. Believe it or not, but Escobar was also the official representative of the Colombian government for the swearing-in of Felipe González in Spain. El Chapo lived by the gun. Guzman, on the other hand, did not enjoy much political clout, but was always wanted by Mexican authorities, especially after eliminating a top DEA agent, Enrique Camarena Salazar. Guzman was always living in different locations in South America, including Guadalajara. However, he gained more notoriety than Escobar. Guzman was forever involved with feuds and wars with opponents. The Tijuana cartel, run by the Arellano Felix clan especially, was one of his worst enemies, and the violence between the two left only a pile of bodies in its wake. The feuding between Guzman and the Arellano Felix brothers was a bloody one that lasted more than 6 months. It went too far when the Cardinal of Guadalajara, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, fell to one of their bullets, caught in a crossfire during a shootout between Guzman and Felix outside Guadalajara International Airport. An enraged Mexican government launched a manhunt for all those involved in the attack, including Guzman. Escobar, on the other hand, enjoyed so much government support that upon pressure from the DEA, the Colombian government put Escobar in prison on his own terms. The prison was a 5-star one made by Escobar himself, which he called the Cathedral. It was a clear mockery of justice, but this was Pablo Escobar, and no government official wanted to be involved in his arrest or incarceration. Their drug empire. Both drug lords worked in different markets. Pablo Escobar concentrated mostly on cocaine. He was a bit more organized than El Chapo, had more control over his empire, and he influenced almost everyone in the country, which led to smoother operations. Escobar was hardly challenged, and that worked in his favor. El Chapo, on the other hand, went the whole hog and dealt with marijuana, cocaine, ecstasy, heroin, and crystal methamphetamine. Escobar's organized way of trafficking drugs was so successful that by the 70s he was the world's biggest cocaine producer, and by the early 80s he was shipping hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine to the voracious U.S. market. However, it is difficult to put an exact figure on his net worth, although it ran into the billions. Escobar earned billions. Escobar became one of the most powerful men in the world and was making more than $420 million a week. By the mid-80s, he was making $22 billion a year. By the end of the 80s, Medellin, under Escobar, was supplying 80% of the world's cocaine and smuggling 15 tons of it into the U.S. every day. Escobar was so influential that he even featured on Forbes' billionaire list with a net worth of $3 billion in 1993. In today's market value, that would be around $6.6 billion. However, Escobar's son, Sebastian Marroquin, went on record to rubbish the figures of Forbes in 2011, saying Forbes hadn't even come close. He also said it wasn't possible to establish a figure from drug trafficking.
What? He said they can't even come close? That man was doo-dooing gold.
As mobsters never keep accounts, least of all his father, Pablo Escobar. Escobar's brother Roberto once said that Escobar was making so much money every year, they would write off 10% of the money because rats were eating the money in storage. And this conjures up a scene from the Will Smith film, Bad Boys 2, where the drug lord's money was being eaten by rats in his storage. Maybe they were influenced by Escobar. El Chapo's billions. When Guzman was arrested in 2019, he too was the wealthiest and most powerful drug lord in Mexico. The fact that Medellin had collapsed by this time gave Guzman the opportunity to exploit the entire market. Guzman was smuggling tons of cocaine shipments from Colombia and Mexico to the United States. He used all modes of transport, land, sea, and air, with a clever network of distribution cells throughout Mexico. He was also importing heroin from Southeast Asia, and together with cocaine, Mexican methamphetamine and marijuana was pushing it into the USA. Guzman was known as godfather of the drug world. By the early 2000s, Guzman became a billionaire. He was ranked the 10th richest man in all of Mexico. To add to his billions, he even established a shipping and transport empire. Although it may have been a front for transporting his drugs, And that's quite an intelligent business to think of, especially when logistics and transport is the prime focus of a business like Guzman's. While Escobar was more the typical businessman type, albeit a dangerous and cold-blooded one, Guzman was more mafia. The DEA referred to him as the godfather of the drug world, and he has often been regarded as the biggest drug lord of all time. Many feel he was far more powerful and dangerous than Pablo Escobar, and is the first one after Al Capone to be named public enemy number 1 because of his criminal activity in Chicago, even though he had never actually been there. Guzman used the power vacuum created by the cartels in Colombia. As soon as the Mexican government cracked down on his rivals, he stepped in and took over. Guzman was ruthless and always went unscathed from government action. By now, the Sinaloa cartel was controlling 35% of the cocaine produced in Colombia, and according to the DEA, it was supplying 80% of the heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine to the Chicago region of the U.S. each year. They loved spending. When it came to spending, both men loved splurging their wealth, and obviously